All right, guys, we're back, and today we're taking a look at FDR and the New Deal. This is basically his response to the Great Depression. And it really is an important and critical turning point in the history of our country. It's incredibly controversial, even to this day. People either see him as the great villain or the great hero, and there's very little in between. The truth is, it probably is somewhere in between, but we're going to take a look and decide for ourselves. So, the very first thing that we have to understand is that the American people had really turned on Herbert Hoover. They had elected this guy, but the Depression hits, and they really view him as a do-nothing president. I don't really see him that way because I try to view him in the context of history. And the reality is he was working within the confines that every other U.S. president had set before him, that precedent. He was not willing to go outside of what he saw as the bounds of the presidency. But the American people are hurting. They need help, and they saw him as not doing enough. So when they do elect FDR, what we're going to see is that he is not going to make that same mistake. He learned a great lesson from Herbert Hoover and the way the American people reacted to him. And he decides that he may be blamed for a lot of different things, but being a do-nothing president is not going to be one of them. He really endears himself to the American public by working tirelessly for solutions to the Great Depression. They're not all going to work. And I think the American people recognize and understand that they're not all going to work, but they appreciate that he was trying to do something, that he was searching for solutions. In addition to that, he really endears himself to them by being more of an open communicator. He had these things called fireside chats in which he would come to them via radio and just kind of talk about the nation's problems and try to set a more optimistic tone. And we're looking, to the future, and we're trying to work on this or that. Solutions are coming. So that was kind of the idea behind a lot of his success. Constantly working, constantly trying new things, and constantly communicating with the American people. What we'll see is that he was so active in his first 100 days in office that became the standard by which all other presidents get judged. Everybody talks about their first 100 days in office, what they're going to accomplish, what they're going to achieve. And I got news for you. None of them accomplish what FDR accomplished in the first 100 days. Again, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, he accomplished a great deal. And so we're going to take a look at a few of these. He's going to introduce this package of legislation that becomes known as the New Deal. It's not one or two pieces of legislation. It's many, many pieces of legislation kind of packaged together and given this broader label. We're giving a new deal to the American people. And all of these New Deal pieces of legislation are aimed at helping to pull the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Now, they are all kind of fit under this umbrella of what he calls the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And it's really kind of interesting here because relief is temporary direct aid. It's giving people help to relieve the pain and suffering caused by the Depression. It's not a long-term fix. It's temporary. It's just to relieve a little bit of that stress, pressure, anxiety, and so forth that are caused by these conditions. Recovery is the more long-term approach. These are the programs that are there. They're there to stay. They're there to provide recovery. It's going to be a long haul, but it's going to lift us out of this thing. And then the programs aimed at reform look at the causes of the Depression and how do we reform our economy? How do we reform our government? How do we reform these agencies so that this never happens again? So relief, recovery, reform, it's kind of a 3-pronged approach to helping end the Great Depression under the umbrella term of the New Deal. So what are some of these programs? FDR first, right out of the gate, he's going to order a bank holiday. Now, this is a little bit controversial because the bank has always been controversial. When we look at Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson or Jackson, right? There's always been stress and disagreement over the idea of the bank and the federal government's response to the bank and so forth. And people aren't sure whether or not FDR has the authority. Does the federal government have the ability to just blanket and close down all of the U.S. banks? And there are a lot of people that would say no, but there are also a lot of people that saw this as such a deep depression that something had to be done and may be willing to look the other way on this. So he closes all the banks down so that they can be inspected. Now, only the healthy banks are going to be allowed to reopen. Some have to be reorganized. Some are going to have to undergo a lot of help and restructuring before they can reopen. And so, excuse me, some are never going to be able to reopen again. So he signs the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, and as banks reopen, they are under the jurisdiction of this kind of act, and it creates what's called the Federal Deposit Insurance Company. All banks today have to be members of the FDIC. And what it does is it really protects our deposits. People had lost faith in banks. After so many of them closed down, after there were so many bank runs, people really had lost faith. So with the FDIC, the government is telling us that you can have faith that your money will be in the bank, that it will be safe, it will be secure. We're trying to reestablish the nation's banking system because it is pivotal, it is key, and people need to be able to trust in it. Once they reopen, a good number of people do put their money in the banks, but a lot of people don't. There are a lot of people who never trust banks again. Ultimately, it probably works, but it doesn't work immediately. It's going to take a while before people's faith in the banks has been returned. And again, there's that question of whether or not it was constitutional for this to take place. There are going to be those debates. There are going to be those questions. And the people who support this are going to look the other way and say, yes, it was, or even if it's not, we don't care. It's necessary. And those that believe it's unnecessary or that it was unconstitutional really begin to look at FDR with a very wary eye. So the next thing that we're going to see is he creates what's called the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this creates a lot of government oversight and regulation within the stock market. One of the major causes of the Great Depression was speculation, inaccurate reporting of information from companies, creating these bubbles and all sorts of different things. There was also the idea of buying on margin. Well, the SEC is going to come in and they are going to begin to regulate all of that so that accurate reporting is done. Companies are forced to file certain reports at certain times of the year, quarterly, about their earnings, and so people have an accurate view of how the company is doing. It also is going to investigate things like insider trading and make sure that everybody has a fair opportunity to invest in the stock market. So the banks and the stock market were two major parts of the collapse. And now we have federal organizations or agencies that are aimed at oversight of these institutions. So both of these would fall under the reform part of the New Deal. Now, the next thing we see here is the Federal Emergency Relief Act, or what becomes known as FERA. And this is going to release federal funds to help states, and it's going to release these funds to the states and allow the states to use them as they see fit. So this is kind of one of those things. Think of this as the predecessor of FEMA, right? The Federal Emergency Management Agency. And what we will see is that this is not a terrible thing because this allows it to be a little bit more local. Remember, Herbert Hoover really pushed for localism, that it was local governments and state governments that knew best how to meet the needs of their people. Well, the Federal Emergency Relief Act kind of takes that same approach, but it releases federal funds to the states so that they can choose where it'll make the most impact. So a lot of people are going to benefit from this. This is one of those things that fits under the first R, and that is relief. We just need some temporary relief, and that's what FERA does. Now, the CCC is kind of an interesting one. This is the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it hired literally millions of young, single, unemployed men to do work on federal land. The goal here is to take young men who are unemployed off the streets. They felt like if we have too many young unemployed men in the country, that they may turn to crime, delinquency, that there's going to be all sorts of problems. So if we take them off the streets and we put them in places where they can have a job, earn an income, and it wasn't great, but it was something. They were housed in camps, usually on federal land. And so they did things like dig irrigation ditches and improve federal lands. Sometimes they did planting of trees. Sometimes they did logging of trees. They did irrigation. They built a lot of things on federal parks and things of that nature. But over 1 million people worked for the CCC, and so it was putting people back to work. This one is more of that recovery. We're putting people back to work. The opponents of this are going to question, though, what happens when the federal government stops employing these men? Isn't this just a temporary fix? Because at a certain point, you can't continue to employ 1 million people just to dig ditches. And so while it may have a temporary effect, once you pull that program, don't all those men become unemployed again? And so there are questions about this. But again, it's going to be much needed temporary relief, or short-term relief anyway, aimed at recovery. Another agency we see is the Public Works Administration, the PWA. And again, it hires millions of people to do things for different communities. It may be things like building hospitals or schools or post offices, building dams and roads and bridges. So it's really aimed at a lot of infrastructure, public works, that are going to really help the states, the communities, the nation to do the things that maybe we hadn't been able to get done before. In the process, it puts people to work. Again, millions of people. Now, most people wanted to see folks back to work, seeing people draw a paycheck, having a pride in what they do. However, again, the critics are worried about how, in a time of Great Depression, how are we funding all these jobs? The federal government does not just have all this money. The money they have, it comes from taxpayers. Well, with fewer people working, there's fewer people paying into the tax system. So they're worried that the federal government is doing a bunch of deficit spending. They're spending money they don't have. They're borrowing from the future. So they worry about the government growing in its power and its scope and going into debt, all these sorts of things. Other people cheered. So if you are employed by one of these CCC or PWA or one of the many other agencies that we're going to see, you probably love this, right? Because it gives you a chance to work and earn a living and have some self-respect and dignity and so forth. But others may question the wisdom of this. Some of the opponents are going to question this because, again, how do we pay for these jobs? What is this doing to our taxes? It's creating a reliance on the federal government as an employer. And that was never what the role of government was supposed to be. So it's kind of this juggling act, this balancing act between what we need as a nation versus what we've always been as a nation, and what we need as a people versus kind of the realities of how do we pay for this and how does this change fundamentally the government that we have. Another one of these agencies is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and they're really going to provide subsidies to farmers to reduce output. They want them to produce less food. If there's less being produced, then the price should go up. And farmers have been hurt by low prices for years. But the American public in the city doesn't really understand this because so many people are struggling to make ends meet, struggling to put food on the table. And here you have farms that are being paid not to produce or to slaughter millions of hogs that aren't going to make it to anybody's dinner table. The AAA is going to, or at least a provision of it, is going to get struck down by the Supreme Court. That's going to become an issue a little bit later on. So we'll see that when we get to it. This is the Tennessee Valley Authority. The TVA, again, is going to employ tens of thousands of people, and their job is to create and build dams specifically in the Tennessee Valley area. And I'll zoom in on this so that you can see the area. All of those red lines are kind of major dams that were built. So it's going to create lakes for recreation. What it really is going to do, though, is create power. All of the area here in kind of this pinkish color, most of Tennessee, big parts of Kentucky, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia are going to gain tremendously from the TVA because those dams create hydroelectric power, and these were some of the last areas in the country to actually get electricity. And so it really is going to help power their life. Next, we see the National Recovery Act, the NRA or the NIRA. It was actually the National Industrial Recovery Act. And it's going to be established to create codes that will regulate almost all industries. It's going to set prices. It's going to set wages. It's going to do all sorts of different things. Now, this is the blue eagle of the NRA, right? Or the NIRA. And places would put this in their window to indicate that they're doing their part, that they're adhering to the codes. The federal government does get sued over this because people are going to argue it's not the federal government's job. It's not within their authority to set prices or to set wages or any of these other things. That's private industries. That's employers who are supposed to do those things. And the Supreme Court is going to knock big portions of this down as well. Again, this is all going to come into play a little bit later on. So some of what we see is a legitimate overreach of power, and we see it getting struck down by the Supreme Court. Others are championed and cheered by the American people because it does either work or bring some form of relief. Now, what we're going to see is that all of that stuff, it had some effect, but not enough to bring us out of the Depression. And so he's going to take a second crack at it. This is called the Second New Deal. It's a new wave of programs aimed at helping to end the Depression. So the Second New Deal is going to include things like the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This is the biggest program that they'd ever done, the biggest agency. It's going to employ 8.5 million people to build parks and roads and paint murals and artists to do all sorts of things. Dorothea Lange famously takes that migrant mother picture that you've seen on every Depression era slideshow or history book. The WPA is enormous. 8.5 million additional people. That's in addition to those that are employed by the TVA and the CCC and the AAA and the PWA. So the federal government is really, they employ almost everybody, it would seem like. And again, that is going to give ammunition to the critics. But if you're one of the people that aids from those jobs, you really champion this. FDR, by the way, again, incredibly popular because of how active he was. He, of course, had his critics, but many people saw him as, well, maybe this is unconstitutional, okay, but we're in such desperate need that we'll look the other way. And so they champion the fact that he's at least attempting, he's trying things. One of the big things that he pushes is the SSA, the Social Security Act, or Social Security Administration. And what this does is it's going to create a little bit of an economic safety net, old age pensions. When you reach a certain age, you can retire, and then you will receive money from the government in a monthly check. This is something that is still around, and it was controversial then. There's some controversy around it now. It was designed to encourage older people to go ahead and retire because you'll have some money coming in, right? You don't need to work because you've done your part, you've reached a certain age, and now government and society are going to take care of you. The goal was that if enough older people retired, it would open up jobs for younger Americans who were unemployed. So the older Americans can be taken care of by Social Security, and the younger Americans can get jobs and take care of themselves. This is something that is really championed by a lot of people. It's also questioned by a lot of people because they feel like this has the beginnings of kind of socialistic tendencies. They're worried about this slide into socialism. And in fairness, what we'll see is that this creates a huge tax burden on the American people because the money that's going to the older Americans is being taken as a tax out of the paychecks of younger Americans. Even today, you work your entire life and big bunches of money are going to come out of your check before you even see it and go to retired Americans for their Social Security pensions. Again, it didn't work as effectively as he had hoped that it would because a lot of people that reached a certain age, they drew that Social Security pension and continued to work. Others retired. There was no one size fits all for that. But it's something that is still with us today and is still pretty controversial today. We will see that he also signs what's called the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this is going to do a lot for labor unions, a lot of the things that labor unions had been pushing for. It's going to set a 40-hour work week. It's going to set a federal minimum wage and restrict child labor. So And it also is going to, FDR is going to allow federal legislation that forces businesses to let employees organize. He's a big fan of labor unions. So there's a lot of things going on here that are fundamentally changing the workplace environment, the government, our tax structure. All sorts of different things are taking place under the New Deal, or the second New Deal. Now, again, he does have his critics, and he had them on both sides. There were people on the left, or very liberal, kind of liberal radicals and socialists, that really felt that FDR was not doing enough. He wasn't going far enough. This is an image of one of them, and this is Huey Long. Huey Long was a governor down in Louisiana, and he wanted to see there be something like today is being pushed as kind of a universal income. He's every man a king. He wanted there to be a check for every American. FDR was making some steps in the right direction, but he wasn't going nearly far enough. He was really challenging FDR and gaining some steam on that front. So he had critics on the far left that wanted him to do even more for the American people, but most of his critics were on the right, the more conservative side of the spectrum. They were concerned about the cost of all of these programs, the rise in taxes. They were concerned about the constitutionality. Excuse me. And they were concerned that this was fundamentally changing the role, the scope, and the responsibility of government. And it was. To be fair, Americans had never looked to the government to be their provider. They had never looked to the government to be the source of their income or the solution to all of their problems until now. Now we really look at the government, and every day from that until now, we really have changed the way we look at the government. The government's supposed to come to the rescue. The government's supposed to come to our aid when we need it. They're supposed to fix all of these problems. And that's a relatively new concept in American history. It all stems from FDR and his New Deal. So there are a lot of people, and I'm going to show this political cartoon. There are millions of political cartoons that are in favor. There are millions that are against. But it really shows FDR seeking more and more and more power. He has an enormous appetite for the growth of presidential power, for personal power, for government power. And so he just continues to seek more. Now, he does so in what I would assume, I would certainly hope, are about America's best interests and doing what he feels is right for the American public. But of course, there are going to be people who disagree with his view of what's best for the American public. We talked a little bit about some of the ways in which the Supreme Court disagreed with FDR. In fact, they're going to strike down 22 different provisions. The AAA and the NIRA are two of the big ones. But when they strike this down, FDR is furious. He is beside himself. How in the world could this group of men in robes decide that this wasn't okay? Here he is working tirelessly, trying to aid the American people, trying to bring them out of the Great Depression, and they were standing in his way. They were striking things down that he felt were really good for the American people. And so he begins to view it as almost an adversarial relationship as opposed to a constitutional one. This is not a good deal, because what we'll see is he actually threatens to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. There were 9. If he adds 6 more, that will mean 15. He said, if you get to a certain age and don't retire, I think the president should be able to add more. Now, if he gets to add 6 more justices, don't you think he's going to add people who agree with him? They're in lockstep with him. He's going to add people that are never going to strike down another New Deal policy. They are going to rubber stamp everything that he does, as opposed to look at things through a constitutional lens. And so they come to know this as the court packing scandal. And again, a political cartoon here. Yes, yes, we all vote yes. And of course, they're all ventriloquists on his lap, right? Saying exactly what he wants them to say, rather than maybe taking a look at things and honest about the Constitution. So that's a serious misstep, because as much as he was a beloved president and seen as a hero by the American people, or by many of the American people, the Supreme Court is really, at that time, still seen as sacred. you don't mess with it, right? That is kind of the pinnacle of our government in terms of making sure that things don't swing too far one way or the other. So there's this massive public outcry. And there were a lot of people that began to look at him as tyrannical, trying to be a king, willing to trample over the Constitution. Here we see Constitution of the United States canceled by FDR, willing to do whatever necessary to get his way. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. So people still love FDR, but he takes a little bit of a beating on this. It's not a good thing. In the end, in the end, it doesn't really matter. He doesn't have to follow through with it. He may have tried, but from that point forward, I think it probably so scared the Supreme Court that they never ruled against him again. And by the time he left office, all but two of the Supreme Court justices were his appointees anyway. And so, of course, they're never going to strike down anything that he wants when he got to appoint 7 out of the 9 justices. Now, is that because they never saw anything unconstitutional with New Deal provisions again? Or is it because they were fearful of the damage it would do if they struck it down and he followed through on his threat to put justices on the Supreme Court to raise the number? That could set a very dangerous precedent. And I don't know what the truth is. I don't know the thinking of the Supreme Court justices at that time, but he doesn't follow through on it in part because he never has to. They don't rule against him anymore. Now, the New Deal is, again, really controversial. It does raise taxes. It raises taxes tremendously in order to pay for all these. It also means that the government is going to be deficit spending, going into tremendous amounts of debt. The federal government becomes the largest employer on planet Earth. They employ over 20 million people, and that in itself is a huge change. It also represents an expanded government power, an expanded role and scope of government. Government is now going to be more intertwined in our daily lives than it ever had been before. So there's a lot of controversy. With that said, FDR is still tremendously important, tremendously powerful, and very, very popular. People saw him really as kind of a savior figure. Many people did, right? The guy does get elected to 4 different terms. He's the only president in history that served more than 2 terms. Everybody else followed the precedent set by George Washington. FDR, because of the Depression and the job not being done, and then because of World War II breaking out, decides to continue to run. That also is a little bit controversial. Now, he does get elected, so people like him, but we do also pass an amendment after that to make it unconstitutional to run for more than 2 terms. I think there was a little bit of an awakening after the fact to go, that was a lot of one president. That was a lot of power. So what we'll see is that the New Deal did not end the Great Depression. But it does fundamentally change the way we think and see about government. The Depression is not going to end until World War II. Once World War II begins and factories are starting to make war goods, everybody's back to work. We're going to see prosperity return. That instantly ends, almost overnight, is going to end the Great Depression. So anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Make sure that you like the video. Leave me any comments. There's, of course, going to be things that I missed, and obviously some pretty controversial material, depending on which side of the aisle that you're on. But be sure to subscribe and look for new material. Thanks.